On the one hand, there's public law. On the other, there's the law that regulates, right, interactions between people within the private sphere. There's laws that interact the relationships between individuals and the state. But as most of us in the room are increasingly aware of, new technologies place increasing stress on this distinction. They facilitate practices and relationships that reconfigure our social and political space. Our panelists today will each focus on some aspect of this challenging terrain, which is one of the big tensions we need to face in dealing with privacy in the 21st century. Now, we have a full panel, so I'm going to do some very brief introductions to let you know who is speaking today. First up is Andrew Clement, a colleague of mine here at the University of Toronto in the Faculty of Information. Many of you know Andrew and his work, and you can look at the detailed biographies in your speaker materials. Andrew has initiated a wide array of important projects regarding privacy and surveillance. Many of them outlined in your materials. He's also quite brilliant at including others in these projects through different technologies like this Surveillance Watch app that enables users to help map surveillance cameras. He's discussed with us today his IXmaps project and the Internet Cloud. After Andrew, we'll hear from Micheal, Vonn, and Kate Milberry. Micheal is a lawyer and the policy director at the BC Civil Liberties Association. Many of you might be familiar with her name these days because she's in the media speaking regularly about CSEC's metadata program and the BCCLA's litigation in that regard. Kate Milberry, her partner for her presentation, is very well known to the Toronto privacy community. She was here as a postdoc some time ago, now as an instructor at the University of Alberta, and her work focuses on the intersections of state surveillance, social movements, social change. They will be speaking to us about national ID cards. After Micheal and Kate is Andrea Slane. Andrea is a professor as well as the director of the Legal Studies program at the University of Ontario Institute of Technology. Also well known to us as Toronto because she's the former executive director of the Centre for Innovation Law and Policy at the University of Toronto. She's a legal expert on privacy, cyberbullying, online child exploitation, and quite a bit more. And has been doing a lot of very important work on the issue of the voluntary sharing of information by organizations with law enforcement agencies, which couldn't be more topical these days. And after Andrea, we have a panel of David Lyon, Scott Thompson, and Kira Grafton-Roche from Queen's. Now, David needs little introduction as one of Canada's titans of surveillance studies, who's done so much to both define this field and encourage its growth. He's the director of the Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's University, and he's brought with us a project he's doing with his students. Scott is a postdoctoral fellow at the Surveillance Studies at Queen's University, whose work currently focuses on unmanned aerial vehicles, or what we might more popularly know from the press as drones. And Kira is a doctoral candidate at the Department of Sociology at Queen's, also working with the Surveillance Studies Center, and also focusing some of her research on UAVs, and they're here to talk to us about that today. So please join me in welcoming our panelists, and without further ado, I will turn it over. They will each speak for 15 minutes, and then at the end we will entertain questions to the panelists as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be on a panel that talks about the interface between public and private entities around privacy issue. In particular, I'm going to be talking about some long-standing research looking at the mapping, the analysis of internet traffic, which very much touches on this question of the relationship between state actors, both as surveillance and security agencies, and also simply as users of the internet, and the relations increasingly close with our telecom providers. This is work I'm most recently doing with Jonathan Milberry, who is here. And we're going to be launching a report next week about this, so we'll give a preview of this. So a little bit of history. Well, Snowden, of course, is well known now for revealing the NSA Surveillance around the world, along with the Five Eyes partners, including Canada. these revelations are not new to those who have been following surveillance. In particular, in 2005 and 6, we knew from Mark Klein, particularly a retired AT&T technician, that the NSA had installed splitter operations in its main switching center in San Francisco, and that was best known as the warrantless wiretapping program. This was enabled legislatively by the FISA Amendments Act. Well, it was retroactively enabled by the FISA Amendments Act. It gave immunity retroactively to the telecom provider, and also the Patriot Act, which has got most of the attention. So at that time, we were very interested in this question of well, whose data is being potentially subject to NSA surveillance. And we embarked on this long program of trying to link up everyday internet traffic, yours, mine, anybody else's who would care, and where it might pass through the sites of suspected surveillance. So that's what we've done. The EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation, sort of provided a graphic that helped people think about how this could be done. The internet, in this terms, is not a cloud, it's a collection of very large servers at the center of big cities. And through that, almost all of our traffic passes, and by installing an attacker in there, you can create a complete copy of the internet traffic, and that's what the NSA has been doing. That's not much more confirmed, but there's certainly evidence at the time. At that time, based on Clement's work particularly, we estimated that there were approximately 18 sites of internet interception in the United States, greater sort of rough rule of thumb, and we came up with these sites. And then we wanted to map traffic, your data, through them, and to be able to report to you, yes, your data went through us to a point of suspected NSA surveillance. At that time, we only knew about the US-based ones. One of the questions we asked, well, with 18, I mean, this is not very many, can we capture, or could the NSA, thinking like an NSA interceptor, presumably want to capture as much of this little few sites as possible. I have no other connection to the NSA than this, so I don't know what they were thinking in particular. But we developed this metric, and we looked at the data in our IXmaps database. We've been collecting through crowdsourcing traffic data. We now have about 30,000 trace routes from a couple thousand different destinations. And so we looked at the data. This is from a while ago. We looked at the trace routes that we had that started in the U.S., ended in the U.S., and to see whether any of them, well, how many passed through one of those 18 cities. And we were somewhat surprised in our database, at least, that 99% of the data traffic of 1,300 went through at least one of those cities. So we don't claim this as a representative sample, but it is extremely, we would say, very persuasively persuasive evidence that the internet is constituted of these very few choke points, and that if you install surveillance equipment in those few places, you can get collect it all, as the slogan goes. With Snowden's revelations, starting on June 5th of last year, we were, of course, intrigued to see what would come out from that. One of the early slides, and this was, I think, from that first day, maybe not quite, but it referred to two very broad programs: the PRISM program, which I think is much better known, which is access to the major tech companies, Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, and so on. But the other side, and this slide indicates you should use both, is what's called upstream. And what we had been studying was the upstream program, where they're collecting data on the fly as it passes through these points, rather than that's at rest in the servers. A much harder technical problem, but one that allows for comprehensive capture of all the data. This, sorry to read, this was a slide that came out at that time, and it shows the Fairview program, which is one of the upstream programs. We think this is AT&T. We looked at the sites that had been indicated there and identified those as possible sites, and we thought there was a very high correlation with the sites that we had done. So we found that was confirming evidence that the interception could be total with relatively few of these sites. Now this research, this recent phase with the support of the Office of the Privacy Commissioner was looking at what are the implications for Canadians of this. What does it mean for us? I mean, this is all very well that the NSA is doing south, but what does it mean for us? Well, the first thing that came to our attention when we looked at the routing of Canadian traffic, domestic Canadian traffic starts in Canada, ends in Canada, doesn't go by the U.S. And we found that something like 25% of the data that we had passed through the U.S. And we estimate this not because of congestion issues and economic efficiency necessarily, but because of carrier connections. Who your carriers hand off to, with your ISP, who does it hand its data off to? It's very selective about this. And we were interested in particular to see that traffic from within one city, Toronto, back to Toronto, often went through the U.S. And here is the trace route of traffic from my office, from our faculty in my office, to the Ontario government, the Ontario Student Assistance Program, across Queen's Park. And it goes by Chicago and New York, and which are most certainly the sites of NSA surveillance. So this we thought was might be of interest to Canadians, and it was very puzzling. It's certainly counterintuitive. The traffic comes and goes through the major switching center at 151 Front Street. It's the largest in Canada. Why not put some fiber across the room and save time, money, and so on? But this is a consistent pattern. These are public institutions. The University of Toronto, the provincial government, they have Ontario-wide networks. Orion, there's the GTA network, which is local universities. They don't even connect to each other. They go through this stuff. This to me is and I hope it is to you, is disturbing and suggests that our public institutions are not paying close attention to the kinds of exposure that they're putting our data to. We also looked in our database for the Boomerang traffic that was destined for federal government sites. Those URLs at nwithgc.ca. And this is 92 of the routes. I'm not really sure if this is a sample or a complete set. But anyway, a large fraction, I don't know what the fraction is, but anyway, a significant fraction of the traffic from Canadians to their federal government passes through the U.S. Again, this might be something for a policy discussion and why that's done. Now we're looking here at the internet service providers that handle Canadians' traffic. Their role in this is critical, obviously, and they carry the data, but they have also their practices determine whether they expose us to NSA surveillance or not. Shortly after Snowden's revelations, this was I think in July or something, Bell came out with an announcement, and you can't read the fine print, but I'll just read part of it. We keep your data secure under the protection of Canadian government regulations. And in this way, this statement should be correct, and the protection that Canadian data has in Canada, whatever our CSEC and other security agencies are doing with it, is higher than it is when it travels to the U.S. And I think it's awesome for making this point very, very clear that the jurisdictional questions are important. We can solve some of these problems, the privacy security problems, within Canada in a way that we can't possibly have as much influence in the U.S. So in this sense, Bell is correct and maybe worthy. On the other hand, Bell is one of the companies that most ships our data to the U.S. Before it hands off to other carriers that doesn't like to trade within Canada. So we wanted to focus more closely on what the Canadian ISPs, the carriers, are doing with our data, and we looked at it from the framework of the Personal Information Privacy Electronic Documents Act, PIPEDA, and we rated about 20 companies companies that carry our data. Most of them are Canadian-owned companies, but there are significant, very large carriers, Cogent, Hurricane, Level 3, and so on, that carry significant amounts of Canadian traffic, but are not in Canada or not Canadian-based. Some of them ship it, carry it inside Canada, some of it is in the US and so on. And we rated them according to 10 criteria based on such terms as, well, first of all, did they actually tell customers that they comply with Canadian law? This, they should, they have to. This is a transparency exercise. We just wanted to see whether they actually inform Canadians that they do or aware of the law that they oblige by. Most of the Canadian companies did, and very few of the American 21 did. We asked them about, we checked their websites. This was completely sort of open source research. It's something that any research, any person can do by looking at the website. If you know the criteria, you can check it yourself. We were interested in the question of, do they inform you? Well, do they say they will inform you when your data is requested, for instance, by law enforcement or security agencies and so on? Very few did. In the States, there's a growing movement to regular transparency reporting on frequency of such requests. Google, Facebook, Twitter, Microsoft, AT&T are doing this under pressure, of course. Do any of our Canadian carriers do it? No. And we think the time has come, and Chris Parsons, who you'll be hearing from later, is doing some great work on this as well, looking into asking them what they're doing. So we think the time is right for much greater transparency. I could go on, but we're going to run out of time. But we have a sort of sneak preview of our report, which will be coming up next week. It rates all of those carriers, and it suggests some of our recommendations. So our findings, I've said most of these, that they tell us very, very little, only 30 out of 200 possible scores could get any sorts of stars at all. And we don't know whether our data, they don't tell us whether our data is likely to be sent by the US to be exposed to the NSA surveillance. Our recommendations that come out of this is first of all, that we should keep Canadian data, at least data that is intended for destinations within Canada, should where possible, be routed through Canada. That should certainly apply to within the city. There's as far as I'm concerned, no particularly good reason why it should leave the city when the capacity is there. Our public institutions, their procurement policies can save money and time, latency anyway, by routing within their local jurisdictions. We also call on the ISPs to be much more transparent about their various activities, about how they get requests, what their definition of data is that's protected. Metadata is controversial right now. That should be treated as personal information. Do they tell us that or not? And of course, we also have to look at the other forms of state surveillance in Canada, and it's becoming clear that CSIC is very similar in many of its activities to the NSA, and we need to know much more about that as well. So that in a nutshell, we'd be very happy to talk to you more about this and answer questions. But that's our research looking at the interplay between our private ISPs and our public institutions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, super as always. Kate, I'm so happy to be back in Toronto with all my privacy piece. And I'm going to talk to you today about the BC Services card, which seems like such a yawn, but it really is this fascinating story that happened, that sort of was birthed by a Freedom of Information request made by BCCLA, which is the Freedom of Information Privacy Association. And they made this request to find out about what was happening with this new, in BC we have what was called care card, so this is our health card. BC people got wind of this, attempt to modernize the care card. We all know what governments mean when they're going to modernize things. And so they did this request, and they got 600 pages of heavily redacted and many duplicated pages, information from our driver insurance corporation, ICBC. And so then Micheal, Vonn, and I got to talking. I was working with civil liberties in BC, and we made this request to the contributions program from the MPC, and this was the ultimate result. But it was quite a lengthy process. I spent the lead research on the project. I spent most of the months in the 12 months that we did this project with no information. We filed, I think, 10 between BC FIPA and BC Civil Liberties Association, 10 freedom of information requests, and we just got the runaround. So we were working with outdated information on government websites and sort of trying to interview people in government who mostly stonewalled us and shut us down. And so we managed to produce the report. At the 11th hour, we did get 300 pages. But what we found was that without consulting anybody, really, even purely technology experts, and certainly not the public, that the BC government was undergoing this process of, they called it technology transformation, and it was to basically bring in this new model, Gov 2.0, Government 2.0, which was digitizing everything. And the problem with this was, and what the BC Services card was going to serve as was this sort of master key to all these previously siloed or segregated databases holding highly personal information from a variety of government service providers and departments, including justice, and family, and children, and health, and of course drivers, licensing, and connect all of these databases together with this master key. And so this idea of sharing is caring, and that we need to access your information to provide services to the citizen. This is what the government was going with, but of course we were somewhat suspicious of this, and so we started looking at the national scene. And what was happening there, and it's been happening for at least a decade or a little bit more, is this plan to create a federated national identity system. We've been promised that there's no ID card as part of this. But we thought that maybe the BC case was in fact going to be a prototype, and we were calling it a national ID card by stealth. And this idea that the card would roll out province by province. And if you know anything, and probably a lot of you are familiar with national ID cards, of course they're not very popular in North America, but in other places around the world, they certainly are, particularly in less democratic regimes. ID cards are very, very popular in those governments. But in Canada and the US, they've been resisted, and it's never really had a lot of uptake in Canada. And so this really seemed like a stealth operation. And although we weren't able to get much information, we have found out that the key technology provider for the federal government is also the same technology provider for the BC Services card. And we have a chapter here called Wrapping Up Canada. And SecureKey has publicly stated that they're interested in wrapping up Canada, which is getting each province to sign on to this ID card initiative, I suppose you could call it. So there's many concerns. Obviously, we make a number of recommendations, but one of them, so obviously the most important concern is the security of personal information. So if you think of things like what health services you access, or are you a criminal, what's your criminal record, or what is your driver's record, what infractions do you have, this is all sensitive data. And there's been no external technology audits that we can find that suggest that the card is technologically secure. And then there is a plan to not only make this a card to access public services, but also to be used by the private sector. So this is concerning, and it brings it into a whole other realm. And then there's been suggested by politicians in BC that it will be used for e-voting. Unfortunately, there's no secure way of online voting as yet. So in our recommendations, we support the Privacy Commissioner of BC, who was not consulted, who in our documents that we found, the lead agency, which will be Ministry of Health and Citizen Services, they directly said not to consult the privacy commissioner. She was consulted maybe 6 weeks before the rollout of the card and was able to issue her report 1 week before the card went live, and she called for a halt. And she said there needs to be a public consultation, which of course we would expect would happen in advance of such a major program that was going to totally revolutionize the way that the government handles personal data. So there has been a consultation. The Micheal's going to talk a little bit about the fallout from the card or what's happened subsequent to, we've had it for about 9 months now. They have not activated the NSA chip, which is the key to sort of unlocking and connecting all this data across jurisdictions and government services. But so we still have time to, the BC government could halt, pause, reconsider, and change direction. But we're not really encouraged. So I'm just going to hand it over to Micheal and let her take it away.
Thanks. It is actually a really interesting story. I'm going to pick it up from the consultation process. A three-part consultation process was implemented by the government. One was an online survey, one was a 2-day event, billed as a specialist event by a private entity called Identity North. And then there was a fascinating citizens panel. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that particular aspect of the consultation. So you can imagine when you're looking at a services card that has the potential to operate like an ID card, that has is envisioned to encompass a scope as broad as all public services provincially, probably federally, for some federally, and then private sector. Trying to figure out how many tentacles and where you start looking to even think through the policy implications are vast. So one means of doing this is, of course, the consultation process. The users panel was fascinating because it used a particular model of trying to drill down to what people think and feel around this card. Now, we've heard many, many claims from the government, and the main thrust of the claims was people want this card. It's convenient, they want it, we have demands for it. And the thing that we discovered in the users panel, which was 36 randomly selected citizens, taken through a process of over 40 hours of education and consultation, facilitated by an independent body to make sure that there was balance in terms of the presentations. The government was presenting their case, the critiquers were presenting their case. The fascinating thing about this panel one was, in terms of people interested in democratic processes, it's one of the most exciting things I've ever been part of. I was deeply cynical, as you can imagine, as the nature of my job. I wanted to know randomly selected by who's going to present what. I wanted to know all those questions. And then we got there with the 36 people, and I was the very last presenter of their entire presentations process. And I was stunned by their level of commitment, by their thoughtfulness, how deeply invested they were in making sure that they, as representatives of British Columbians, would have thought through this process. And I can tell you a bunch of things about that process without having the report in hand, because you will not be surprised to hear, after you've heard Kate say, that there were massive delays in making any of this information timely, accessible in a timely fashion for the research, for the report, for the rollout, for anything. We still have not gotten the 36 citizens' report on what they believe should happen with the card. What I do know from being there is that there was not a huge amount of buy-in. That the citizens were disappointed that one of the constraints of the consultation were they were not supposed to be able to say no to the card. We issued a press release on the subject. BC government will not take no for an answer, right? They were only allowed to shape the use of the card. And again, there was pushback on that. There may, in fact, be a minority report that comes out of the citizens panel because of their concerns about cost effectiveness, the potential for data linkages, the concerns about the security of information that has been queried in British Columbia in the main through the Auditor General's audits, security audits of all kinds of IT initiatives in government. So it was a very, very thoughtful, I felt, and not the least bit ready to just take on board claims approach by the citizens panel, but we have not yet seen the report. And again, that's very disappointing because we are seeing the rollout. Now, the report that we have seen comes from the specialist swarm. And I suggest that some of the data from that report is actually quite telling. The piece that I'll draw your attention to is the numbers. We have, as of October 31st, 2013, approximately 700,000 cards that have rolled out. But intriguingly, given the government's push for why you want the version of the card that combines your MSP, medical services plan, with your driver's license. Right? The combined card is given the gold card status. You want this one, it's the most convenient, it's the best. Less than half of people who are being hard pushed this sell are saying yes to the combo card. I think that's very telling, again, when the government is making a claim that citizens are banging down the door for this kind of potential, for this kind of all-in-one card. Now, the other thing I want to tell you about the tentacles that are flowing out, and this is breaking news in British Columbia. It's happening as we're speaking right now. Those other databases, those other community, those other public sector databases include a controversy that we've had around the education database. BCESIS was the name of the database that basically flopped through a series of efficacy and security problems after the government spent a long time creating a database for students. And when that went down, the government said, we are going to replace this again with proprietary software and government issued data system. But school districts had the option of opting out to create their own data system for student information. And what we just discovered, and when I say this is breaking news, I mean within this week, the BC Teachers Federation has raised the flag because it would appear that some of these school districts who have spent up to $1.5 million to develop their own systems that are less invasive in terms of what they call for data collection, that they have their own autonomous control over. Those systems are now being essentially vitiated by the government, who have just introduced the new criteria for the independent systems that they must be interoperable with the BC Services Card. So in their contract with the private contractor, the government has promised that they are essentially going to push business towards the card, and this is one of the means that they're going to be doing it. So we have another system, right, the independent system, the data silos that are collecting student information that are now having this political kind of dynamic around the use of the BC Services Card. So one, I want to say, citizens do actually care. We've seen that from the consultation process, although whether or not you get a report on that is another question. So I'm glad I'm here to tell you about that. Two, that the numbers are not outstanding, especially given the push sell on this, the hard sell that people are getting at ICBC when they're required to get a driver's license. I have seen myself the sell that people are subjected to. People are not intuitively, probably, less than having a lot of information about this. There is some resistance to this. And three, that we're starting to see that some of the, we haven't anticipated all of the tentacles, but one is going to be to drive a kind of uniformity of data systems through the card that we hadn't anticipated. It was not one of the things that we had discussed in the report, but as I say, there's a resolution going forward in the BCTF literally as we're speaking right now. So that's breaking news, and we will of course keep you apprised of developments on our website and in the media. Thank you so much.
Okay, hi everybody. I'm Andrew Sling, and I'm going to be talking about basically whittling it down to this question that I put on the slide here. So what is the legitimate scope of third-party voluntary cooperation with police investigations? And by phrasing it that way, I think I've kind of showed my hand a little bit in that I do think there is a legitimate scope of third-party voluntary cooperation with police investigations, although I also think there is a illegitimate scope. So that just gives you some fair warning on that. I think it might be helpful to have a little bit of background into how I got interested in this topic or how I got involved in it, because I've been working on it for about 10 years. And that is that back in 2004, I was pretty loosely associated with the Center for Innovation Law and Policy as a recent graduate of the law school and a research fellow there. And at that time, the center received some money from Microsoft to put on an international conference on online child exploitation. And pretty much nobody wanted to do it, so I ended up doing it because it was a topic I was interested in but didn't really have any expertise in. I was also at that time employed at one of the larger business law firms here in Toronto, so I had to justify to my employer why I would be doing this basically criminal law-oriented kind of event. So I justified it by saying I was going to look at it mainly from the perspective of internet service providers and what their obligations might be, or the scope of their choices for participating in crime control. So that's why I kind of got into it, and as a result, since there was not really many other people interested in that interface at that time, I also came to sort of find myself, frankly, doing things like facilitating conversations between law enforcement and internet service providers about what the scope of their interactions should be, and then participated in some more national-oriented meetings of CCASE, which is the Canadian Coalition Against Internet Child Exploitation, which ended up being the place where what ended up being called the Letter of Request Protocol was established, which came to be the subject of a lot of court cases after that. And the Letter of Request Protocol, just to make it clear to people, is a mechanism by which police could send a form letter to the major internet service providers in Canada, and it's basically those that were participating in CCASE, or sort of the big five. And in that letter, would specify that they were conducting a child exploitation investigation, that they required the customer name and address associated with an internet protocol address at a particular date and time, and would the internet service provider please provide that voluntarily. And the large internet service providers had agreed at the CCASE meetings that they would honor those requests. And that's what ultimately became under challenge, whether that was contrary to Section 8 of the Charter or not. I also should say that the internet service providers at those meetings were very clear that they were going to limit their voluntary cooperation to online child exploitation investigations and not provide this information under other kinds of investigations, and also that police were clear that that was just the beginning of their investigation, and thereafter they would be doing further investigation, and most of the time what ended up happening if they did proceed any further is that they would get a warrant to then go to residents, and then they would uncover further evidence of these crimes, and then charges would be laid and they would go from there. So obviously the only ones who came to court are the ones where that happened. And so when cases started cropping up, it was defendants who were challenging how their identity had been connected with their anonymous internet activity, whereby they were exchanging child pornography materials, and then the aim of that would be then to initiate the warrant that uncovered the further evidence and get that tossed out so that they could have the entire case fall apart. All right, so time goes by and these cases start happening at the trial level, and what I was following with interest because of my involvement in that process. And some troubling things started to occur with the trial level cases, where there was some significant flaws in the reasoning that the trial judges were putting out there for upholding this practice. So that even though I was like sort of generally interested in seeing what would happen with it, I was not happy with the way that that the trial judges were rationalizing how this process was not a violation of Section 8. And in fact, most of the cases were decided against defendants who were trying to challenge the process on the basis that they didn't have a reasonable expectation of privacy in their customer information under those circumstances. So Lisa and I wrote an article in 2011, which we sort of put together, really with the express purpose of influencing the Ontario Court of Appeal, which was hearing one of these trial level cases that was going forward on appeal, which was Ward, and there had been two other cases that went from the trial level up to the Court of Appeal in Saskatchewan. That was Trapp and Spencer, and just sort of fast forward a little bit, Spencer was then further appealed to the Supreme Court of Canada and was heard just this past December. We're still waiting for a decision on that, so it's kind of all in the air right now around that. But what Lisa and I talked about then was some of these problems with the trial level decisions and how they were really sort of opening the door way too wide for voluntary cooperation, and also further making it possible that if things were not corrected about the legal reasoning, that mandatory cooperation, which was at the time on the table with Bill C-30, would be legal if we weren't careful about that. So, all right, so I'll just briefly lay out what the three main flaws were in the trial level cases that we talked about back then. And then I'll move forward into what I did with this most recent grant from the Privacy Commissioner's Office, which was to really unpack the Ward decision that the Ontario Court of Appeal came out with, which I thought had some good points. And then to maybe improve upon, suggest improvements upon them to maybe see if the Supreme Court will further correct some of these problems. So the first one is that, and this is kind of like sort of prosaic by now, really old-fashioned technology, what everybody else is talking about. But there was failure, even still at the later levels, to recognize what kind of information customer name and address would be when it's connected to an IP address. So there was a lot of trouble with the trial level cases in not recognizing its sensitivity. I think some of that was corrected in the Court of Appeal decision, but it remains an issue that there's not a tremendous amount of appreciation for what happened when anonymity is unmasked. The second flaw is that there was excessive reliance on subscriber agreements between internet service providers and customers to determine the level of privacy protection that a customer can expect. And as we all know, those kind of agreements are not negotiated. So customers generally aren't even particularly aware. But a lot was made, especially at the trial level, and continues to be made, the importance of these as at least one factor to consider in whether or not it reduces at least a person's expectation of privacy if it's set out in those agreements that the service provider is willing to cooperate with police. And then, maybe I can go forward, that's what I just said. And then the next thing is that there's also in these cases, and this one is the one that I'm focusing on just for the last bit of this presentation. So there was a failure to identify any constraints on voluntary cooperation within the legislative regime that we currently have. So most of that is FIPPA. Some industries are certainly governed by other legislation as well, or provincial legislation if it's within the province and that it has one like that. But basically what happened in the trial level cases is that they really just looked at pretty much the same argument that had been presented to the internet service providers back in the mid-2000s when they were being convinced that they could, legally provide information to police without any consequences. And that is an interaction between Section 47.0141 of the Criminal Code and one of the exception to knowledge and consent provisions in PIPEDA, which is in Section 73C.12. So I just want to show you what they look like, since not everybody knows them offhand like I do. But so in the Criminal Code, the section that I've been mentioning is that it states that for greater certainty, no production order is necessary for a peace officer or public officer enforcing or administering this or any other act of Parliament to ask a person to voluntarily provide to the officer documents, data, or information that the person is not prohibited by law from disclosing. For greater certainty is kind of important because this is a fairly new provision, but it's put in there as a codification of a common law power that previously existed. So it's not like new, obviously, that police officers ask people to voluntarily provide information. But because it's written down, there was some focus on specific wording of it, and especially on this last bit, not prohibited by law from disclosing, because that's what kicked the trial level courts over into looking at mostly PIPEDA or whatever legislation applied to see as if that would be the pretty much the only place where that prohibition would come about. So PIPEDA is privacy protection legislation, as we all know, but it does have this kind of robust exception section in Section 7 that sets out, Section 1 is collection, Section 2 is use, and then subsection 3 is for disclosure. And it does have this, as you go down this very long list of specifications, you get down to this one, which says that it is permissible, basically, for a organization that's governed by PIPEDA to disclose information without the knowledge and consent of the individual if a request is made by a government institution that's identified as lawful authority, and if they want to obtain that information in service of enforcing a law of Canada or a province or foreign jurisdiction, or carrying out an investigation, etc., gathering intelligence. This is a hugely broadly phrased exception. You can just drive a truck through it the way that it's phrased. So what was troubling to Lisa and I back then, and remained troubling, is that there didn't appear to be any constraints, just if you look at the words. And what we were suggesting back then to the Court of Appeal, which they, I think, I'm going to just correct themselves too, but they did cite us, which is nice. That there actually are some constraints even within PIPEDA, and that would be that PIPEDA overall requires that there be this internal reasonableness standard that governs the legislation as a whole. And that's set out in the purpose section, Section 3, and the application section, Section 5. And so that is that organizations are balancing, their needs, their obligations to protect privacy of their customers, employees, and against their own interests in using, collecting, using, and disclosing the information. They can only do so for purposes that a reasonable person would consider appropriate in the circumstances. So that does beg the question of what is reasonable in this context, and so it meant having to unpack what kind of reasonableness standard that is. It has to be a normative standard in order to meet, I think, in the end, with these cases, a requirement under Section 8 that we're talking about, what would be accepted in a free and democratic society. But I think, importantly, and this is where the new project led me through the Ward case, is that there is a somewhat different standard that applies to private actors than what applies to state actors, because private actors can balance their own self-interest against that of their obligations towards their customers, whereas state actors cannot have self-interest play into they are meant to speak always for collective interests in maintaining the values of a free and democratic society. So I only have a little bit left, but I think the Ontario Court of Appeal decision in Ward did try to set out something that could be a kind of a test, a kind of way of evaluating what sort of balancing goes on to determine whether private actors are acting reasonably when they cooperate with the police. And I think this is important partly because, while we're talking about internet service providers here, we're talking about, customer name and address linked to an IP address, these situations do come up in a lot of different contexts. There's lots and lots of industries that, have information that is of interest to law enforcement. So a test that is broader and, able to handle different and new situations as they come up is important. So I don't have a lot of time to go through this, but and that tells me that I'm out of time. Okay, even if she didn't tell me. Okay, so I'm just going to take 1 minute to wrap it up. But it's important that we get this right, and I have been struggling with this, believe me, for a couple of years now, sort of try to be able to articulate this in a way that that does preserve those obligations towards customers that we embrace, but that also provides for some sense that there are autonomy interests at stake with third parties who would want to participate in crime control, especially where it is specifically linked to their services or facilities, and that they would want to have some guidance on what kind of nexus there should be between their own self-interest and their obligations towards their customers. So that's what I've been working on. I did publish a paper in Queen's Law Journal a couple of months ago on this topic, so you can look at that. And I think I should probably just close there and entertain questions at the end. Thank you.
Good to be here. I'm going to start with a brief comment about a piece that we're producing from the new transparency project. For some time, I had wanted to, us as a team, to produce a piece of work that would kind of give to Canadians what we have been trying to research over a number of years. And we're going to be launching our report. It's in the vernacular, it's not an academic report, on the 8th of May this year. It's called Transparent Lives, Surveillance in Canada, IXmaps, that's also Canada. And it'll come up in French and English on the same day, and also a free PDF online. So you'll be able to find it online just as Transparent Lives. And it details 9 key trends in surveillance in Canada today, and makes some recommendations. So that has nothing to do with the presentation now, except we did mention drones a little bit in that document. So our team has been doing work funded by the OPC Contributions Program on drones in Canada. We'll come to the question of whether they should be called drones or UAVs or RPAVs or whatever else. And this is something that has been growing rapidly. Increasingly used for a number of different purposes. Increases are quite rapid in some areas. So, for example, in Saskatchewan, the RCMP in 2011 had 27 scenes where they used drones. In 2012, there were 47. By 2013, there were 125. So the increase in just one area is very clear. We focus on the implications of these aerial vehicles for organizations that are accountable to PPA. But, as we said for the introduction of this session, some of the issues are very confusing between what might be covered and what might not be covered by PPA. And we have looked at a number of different aspects in order to try to get a handle on drones. This is something that is very under-researched, and we know very little, really, about what is actually happening. So we looked at the historical development. There's some very interesting ways in which Canada has been a leader in this area for several decades since the Second World War. We look at privacy-sensitive aspects, obviously. We look at marketing by Canadian corporations, and with some of my students, I was at the Unmanned Systems Conference in Vancouver last November, and so we got to talk with people who are designing and making and selling drones, and also to military and policing people who were also at that event. And we also had Vision Critical do some public opinion work for us in trying to understand how Canadians understand these things, if they do at all. And that piece of research also included, Vision Critical did a study of US and British opinion for us at the same time. So, and for those of you who are interested in that research, we put all our data into the public domain immediately, and so it's available through the Queen's archive. So, as I say, this is a complex area. And we're going to start with a little comment about time denial. We don't know exactly which police departments use drones and which do not, and also here's one area where there are complex relationships between public and private. Just a couple of neat quotations for you. Mr. Dewars of BCRCMP says, "We won't be doing surveillance, just aerial photography." And another one from Jerome Engeley from the Saskatchewan RCMP. "There's so many applications, you're crazy not to use it." So, who knew? Who knew, for example, that last week, very close to Kingston, where we are, 25 minutes east of us, there was, well, you probably heard on the news, the CN rail, which also, of course, carries via, was closed down by the OPP at the site of the Mohawk community at Tandanara. And in this case, there were drones used. The people at Tandanara are quite used to drones flying over the reserve, as it happens. But there were drones used in this case. As you can see, it wasn't exactly a mass demonstration. There were just a few people involved, and it was more of a kind of a request for information from the government about when anything was going to be done about an investigation into the missing and murdered Indigenous women in Canada. That was why they wanted to do this, and they simply put the TP up on the road, and it's also near the rail crossing, and that's why we closed the railway. So there are a couple of interesting things here. One is that how police departments get to use the drones is a good question in itself. They need to have the training, by and large, comes from the corporations that sell these things. Those of you who know Ursula Franklin will know her phrase, "Every tool shapes the task." And it's very interesting, and not just in the area of drones, but in others too, how the corporations and the way they sell their equipment in a number of areas, including, we think, drones, help to shape the task that is carried out by their customers. So that's one aspect of the connection between policing and the private sphere. The other is, of course, that we've been looking at Canadian corporations that make drones. And it's also the case here that the drones are produced in a way that is very much in line with policing needs. So the drones flew over the First Nations site, and we can see that there are some interesting responses to that if you look at the Twitter feed from the day. The different parties were involved in sending the Twitter feed. The photo on the left is one taken by a protester off the machine that was in the air. So, the OPP offered this: unmanned aerial vehicles are an economical way to take pictures. It's a tool used in investigations. Or, OPP aerial vehicle only takes photos and videos, which is no doubt intended to sound reassuring and encouraging for all those who hear it. However, there were other kinds of comments that appeared on the Twitter feed, and it's very interesting to see that from the point of view of those who were on the ground, the question had more to do with why are they bringing in military methods, or how is this situation actually being escalated? And a word that appears frequently is that of intimidation. So you see, the question of what exactly is going on and whether privacy is perceived to be the issue is a difficult one for us to decide. And so you can see what the Twitter feed was there. But the ways in which the machines are already used have already been described by the local community there, by the local people there, as intimidating. But they also use the word spying. And so from the point of view of those who are on the ground, they obviously have some sense that there is an inappropriate watching going on from these machines. So whether it's the public and private aspects of the machines that are in question, or the responses of ordinary people on the ground, both of which we were also trying to get at in our research in general, that is where we are going. So I'm going to hand over to Kira for the next section.
Hi everyone, thanks David. Let me just see if I can figure this out. Okay, that's where we are. So what does this case at the Kainanaga Reserve represent? How does it link back to our report? So some of the overall themes that we see is that there is a lack of awareness and there's no shared context of privacy between individuals and between policing agencies, let's say, in the Kainanaga case. Individuals at the protest, as we saw from the Twitter feed, felt very uncomfortable. They were unsure why the UAV had been deployed. They were unaware of the reasons. We also see in our report that there's a lack of consultation with the public. That's one of the reasons that they don't have the awareness about UAVs. And there's a lack of accessibility to information about regulation and about how UAVs are being used in Canada. So just moving on, these are some of the statistics from our Vision Critical survey results. So our group, a team of about 5 of us with Dr. Lyon as our head, we came up with a set of questions to give Vision Critical to ask the public about their opinions on UAV use, about their awareness of what UAVs are being used for. So on the one column, you've got the piloted vehicle. So how aware are you of piloted vehicles being used for the various applications there? And in the other column, you have the UAV usages listed. In the red, for package delivery, people are not very aware of UAVs being used in that case. And then the yellow highlights the highest numbers of awareness. So things like aerial photography, cartography, atmospheric weather assessment, people almost have more awareness of that than the piloted, and then search and rescue as well. So these questions have the goal of assessing the areas where people had awareness for the use of UAVs. Here's some more statistics and public opinion. So we wanted to ask individuals questions relating to data sharing, collection, and visibility. And the question itself said, regardless of who collects the information and for what purpose, to what extent do you support or oppose the use of, and we have a couple of different categories just to kind of have a compare and contrast with our responses. So piloted vehicles, unmanned aerial vehicles, or autonomous unmanned aerial vehicles were inserted into that question. So how comfortable or do you support or oppose the use of UAVs in these scenarios? So, to what extent do you support UAVs flying too high to be seen? People were 87% against that. They didn't like not being able to see the UAV. To what extent would you be happy with your information, let's say, being shared with the US government? 89% of individuals were against that. 93% were against a UAV being able to see into your home. And 87% were uncomfortable with that information being shared with the Canadian government. And there are issues with the various frequencies that are used to operate UAVs, and my colleague Scott will get back to that a little bit later when it comes along. So lack of consultation. There's a working group at Transport Canada, and they build regulations for UAVs to operate. As you can see in that list there, the working group membership, other individuals, industry membership is coordinated by Unmanned Systems Canada. There are no members from privacy commissions, civil libertarian groups, or public interest groups. No academics have been involved in this process of creating regulation either. As well, the proceedings aren't accessible to the public. These websites haven't been updated in a number of years, while we know that the growth and use of UAVs has proliferated rapidly. Additionally, no privacy impact assessments have been submitted for UAV-related programs with the OPC to date, as far as we found out. And as well, recommendations to the UAV working group have been, or by the UAV working group, that certain UAVs are excluded from the regulations. And these are some of the more common or popular UAVs, such as the Ariane Scout. So this really leads to an issue where they're recommending not using the tools, and individuals aren't even aware. We're out of time, but can we pass on? Okay, so I'll invite Scott up. Scott is going to talk more about the lack of accessibility that we face with UAVs.
All right, so I'll do my best to speak very quickly. So we were really interested in who knows, or who's supposed to know about drones and how they're running in Canada. And we wanted to answer this question to really understand the context, or what's the privacy context for drones, to kind of get a shared understanding within the Canadian population. So right now, drones are regulated by two different organizations. One is Transport Canada, who actually issues certificates for each flight of drones. The second group is Industry Canada, who takes care of the bandwidth, or the frequency that the drones use to communicate with the ground. Okay, so looking at Transport Canada first. So we contacted Transport Canada to find out, just basic statistics of the number of drone flights increasing, or how are they changing over time. And I was fascinated to hear that they have absolutely no electronic records of these flights. Even though every single flight has to apply for a special flight operation certificate and be granted one of those certificates by Transport Canada, those certificates are only held in paper copy, and they are not even centralized in one location. They are actually held at the different regional sites around the country. So yeah, only paper existed. So for myself, I was like, really? Is this really is what we have? And how do you know what drones are flying around, and how do we know how that relates to other craft and all of that? And they were very clear, yeah, we have no electronic records of any of this. So I also asked them about the privacy requirements that are part of those certificates, and they said there's absolutely no sections that deal with the privacy implications. They are very focused on the safety that is associated with these flights. Now, we put in a Freedom of Information or an ASIC request to get all of the records, a complete record of every single UAV flight in Canada. And what we got back from them was highly redacted. You know, like, what they argued was that all of this information about these flights were proprietary. And the example they gave was that, say, a mining company was wanting to fly UAV, and they didn't want other companies to know where they were looking for new mining sites. You know, so Transport Canada said, you know, we'll give you the certificates, but all of the information will be removed from it. And we're kind of working through this right now. So moving on to Industry Canada, their job is to manage the bandwidth or the frequency, because there's various different users of frequency, including your cell phones and other applications. And it's very important that these uses be kept separate, you know, because in the case of drones in particular, any sort of interaction with the drones can actually cause them to crash. So in Canada, unlike any other country, or any other NATO country, we did not, before 2009, have a separate frequency for UAV flights. Every other NATO country in the world uses the same frequency, the 14.5 to 15.35. And Canada, because our telecoms wanted that frequency for cell phone use, we actually have allocated a large portion of that band for cell phones right now. So in 2009, Transport Canada says, you know, this goes against DND's policy of bringing in drones to protect Canada, so this has to change. So in 2009, they put out this footnote, which says that by 2013, this bandwidth will be shared between the military and telephones, and then by 2017, it will be exclusively used by drone flights. Okay. Now the other thing is we put an ASIC in requesting with Industry Canada as well, and they said that they weren't really sure. They're really happy sharing this data with us because maybe we could hack in and there'd be privacy concerns about us getting access to the specific bandwidths that different drones were using. I just thought that was kind of funny. I'm almost done, I swear. Where? Interference, sorry. Yeah, so, sorry. So right now, because, okay. So right now, because of this, this sharing of the bandwidth that UAV use, we kind of have this quasi protection from UAV flights from the United States. A lot of people probably have heard of UAVs that have been seen kind of doing strange things or that have crashed in Canada, and the evidence suggests that the reason that is because our telecoms or our cell phone data is actually interfering with those flights and causing those crashes. So until 2017, we had this kind of quasi-protection from U.S. airforce. Okay. Yeah, so just to kind of close it out, we were talking about many different recommendations. You know, there's many that come to mind, but one that I really feel is important and we should stress is that we need to develop this kind of shared contextual understanding of the spaces where drones are being used. You know, if we're going to have an intelligent debate about whether we want to use these technologies or how they should be used, because I do believe that there are uses that are valid, we really need to know, you know, how they're being used and why. And that's it. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all our panelists. This panel started a little bit late, so I'm hoping there's still time for some questions from the audience. Revelations of those paper records made me think we need a drone ID project, right? If we're going to put the rest of us with these cards, maybe we can do it with the drones. But, is there a microphone that's going around in the audience? Great, yes.
Very quickly, I saw the list of drone uses. One that wasn't there was reporters. I recently watched an Al Jazeera piece where, especially in places like Turkey and other places, or on the front lines of protests around the G20, where progressive reporters are using drones to bypass police lines and police restrictions to report on oppression. And I wondered if they could talk a little bit about, it's unlikely we're going to be able to put the drone back in the bottle, as it were, so what are the progressive uses for drones?
Do you want to pass it like to?
We did look at that in the public opinion, and what was really interesting to me that, you know, I was kind of expecting support, the same as you, but the public is very, very skeptical about the use by media corporations. It's one of the lowest support. But the other thing we kind of found is that when you compare all the different groups or all the applications that drones can be used for, you get a general fall in support for the general public when you compare it to man or other cases like this.
Karen, do you want to add anything?
Other questions? Yes, in fact.
Thanks. I'll start. For Andrea, in a situation where a confirmed criminal activity has been identified using the internet, an IP address, and the police have determined through either consent from the ISP or a search warrant that the IP address is actually originating outside of Canada or the United States via a VPN, a virtual private network service. What are the next steps for the police to continue to obtain the originating IP address from Canada that was then replaced by the VPN provider's IP address offshore? What can happen if they are going to find the source?
Well, interestingly, the cases that we have are actually the simple ones, because it's not clear what they are doing. I know there are international cooperation agreements to pass things off as need be, when we do identify where something is originating from, but I'm not sure how sophisticated they are as far as actually being able to unpack somebody who's a quite sophisticated anonymizer of their activity online. The guys that end up in court tend to be the ones who are not sophisticated. And so, and in fact, at least the police narrative is that there's this huge amount of people out there who are doing this. And so, they just take the easy pickings at this point to sort of make an example of it or whatever, and the ones that they can secure conviction. And there's a very high conviction rate, very high guilty plea rate of these sorts of things, because they tend to be the cases that are pretty open and shut. So these cases are ones where, they only chose to proceed because they could easily identify who was using the IP address at that time. It wasn't a wireless connection, it was a wired connection, so it wasn't like somebody in the neighborhood was like stealing the service. There was limited people living in the residence, it wasn't an apartment building, any of those sorts of things, right? Like, so, we don't know exactly how sophisticated their capacity is at this point to track things down beyond these sort of, dodo cases.
Time for a couple of questions? Yes.
Yeah. I was just curious with the drones, you talked about the use by police and for surveillance. I'm just curious about the use by private security for surveillance, or like in Canada, that wasn't the railways that were doing surveillance, and I guess CN is kind of a police force, but like where big corporations and private security contractors using drone surveillance in Canada that we know about.
As you probably gathered from from our presentation, there are awful lots of things that we don't know, and some things that are very hard to find out. What is the case is that if you look at our own manufacturers, and in Canada there are also American manufacturers' equipment that is used, but we're looking primarily at Canadian manufacturers. If you look at their advertising and if you hear what their representatives say, then they talk freely about the private policing and private security uses of drones. And so it's another way in which there is just a confusion and a mixing of areas that used once to be much more separate. It's clear that we have to think about the public and private working in conjunction with each other. So yeah, in terms of advertising, what we don't know, what we haven't found out about, is the specific cases in which people are actually using drones for private security.
Time for last question? Yes.
I heard twice that privacy commissions haven't been consulted. Is that a new trend? Is it a trend, or is it old?
What was the question?
Twice we heard that privacy commissioners were not consulted. And I'd like to know whether that's a trend, whether it's a new trend, or whether it's always been on major technological innovations.
I don't know. I don't know if it's a trend. Certainly, let me put it this way. The more troublesome the case in terms of making the public aware, I would say whether or not it's a trend, that the cases that we find are the ones where it would appear that they're anticipating resistance. That's all I can say about the cases that I can cite, at least from my own jurisdiction. So, you know, the kind of mechanism that we'd like to see kind of evolve here for policing, for example. Policing should have, in our view, the civil liberties view from British Columbia, policing should have a requirement that when you're introducing new surveillance technology into a police force, that it automatically go for policy review, and that includes a privacy impact assessment. So the idea is, you know, we find out about these things after the fact, and then we put in requests, what have you got, what have you done, where's your policy on it, and we often find the lacuna. Drones are an example of that, but they're not the only ones. And if you actually file an ATIP to ask, for example, your local municipal police department, are you using IMSI catchers or otherwise trying to intercept IP addresses or other things, you're going to get an FBI response. We will neither confirm or deny. What you want to know is that somebody, even if there's an argument for this would decrease the efficacy of law enforcement if the public knew we were using X, Y, and Z, that somebody, be it the policing board, somebody at the AG or Solgen's office provincially is reviewing this for policy purposes so we can appropriately constrain them. And in our view, that is not happening. And as I say, I'm not sure if it's a trend, but I think the key here is the more troubling we expect this to be from the public's perspective, the more likely we are to get off the stage.
On that happy note, please join me in thanking all of our panelists. We have a new thing.
A couple of small housekeeping announcements. Lunch will take place from now until approximately 12:50, 10 to 1, at which point we'll invite our keynote speaker to begin speaking. You're welcome to continue with your lunch as he speaks, but his presentation will begin about 10 to 1. The other announcement is that this afternoon we will have a presentation in French. So for those of you who would like to avail yourself of a headset to take advantage of our simultaneous interpretation, those headsets are available from our technician at the back, and you will need to provide a piece of identification in exchange for which will then be returned to you when you get us back the headset. So thank you very much and enjoy your lunch.
Thank you.
So yeah, ID card as tool to discipline resistors on other kinds of surveillance.
Oh, sorry.
Breaking news.
Oh, should I tell them that it's out in the other room? They'll figure it out, won't they?
It is, and they're prepared to cost